Assalamu alaikum. This is lecture number 5 of Pakistan Studies. The topic is Major Political Developments 1857 to 1918. These two dates are important. 1857 was the year when there was the uprising in India against the British. And in 1858, the British government, that is the British Crown, directly assumed the responsibilities of India. 1918 is the year when First World War came to an end. Today, in this lecture, we will be talking about the major and important developments during this period. This was an important phase, a period of decline of Muslims, then their revival. The identity formation of the Muslims and their political positioning. We have discussed some of the topics in the earlier lectures. We will not be repeating that. For example, we have talked about the decline of the Muslims after 1857. We have discussed in detail the role of the Aligarh movement, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and his colleagues. We have talked about the establishment of Congress, Muslim attitude, Hindi-Urdu controversy, revivalist movements. All these topics have been discussed, so there is no need of discussing them here. In this lecture, what we are going to do is to discuss important developments from the beginning of the 20th century to 1918. That is, what were the major developments that influenced Muslim interests and Muslim identity formation process. First, we'll talk about the partition of Bengal. The second topic we will be discussing is the SIMLA Deputation of 1906, the formation of the Muslim League, again in the same year, 1906, changes in the goals and objectives of the Muslim League in 1913, and lastly, we'll talk about the LACKNOW Pact, that is, political arrangement between the Congress Party and the Muslim League in 1916. Let's take up the first topic, that is the partition of Bengal in 1905. At that time, Bengal was a united province, a very large province. Its area was approximately 1,89,000 square miles. In today's context, United Bengal meant the present-day Indian state of West Bengal plus what is now Bangladesh, and you could also add up some territory of Indian state of Assam. So it was a big province, and unmanageable for one lieutenant governor based in Calcutta. The negative impact of such a big province was mainly on the eastern regions of Bengal, where Muslims were in majority. Viceroy Lord Curzon decided in 1905, purely on administrative grounds, that Bengal should be divided into two provinces, East Bengal and West Bengal. The East Bengal province had what is Eastern Bengal and Assam. Or you could say that the Eastern Bengal was more or less East Pakistan of 1947 or Bangladesh of today. West Bengal is more or less what is West Bengal today. So in place of one, in 1905, two different provinces were established. The idea of partitioning Bengal was opposed by Hindu organizations. They had started opposing it before it was actually implemented. And when it was implemented in 1905, they were up against this decision. A massive agitation was launched by different Hindu organizations. They described the partition of Bengal as a conspiracy to divide and fragment Indian political forces. To them, it was a division of motherland. Therefore, they opposed it. And subsequently, the Congress party also joined this agitation. The Congress party also opposed the partition of Bengal, and other groups that had spearheaded this movement resorted to violence, killings, and violence of all sorts. The Muslims were in favor of partition because it provided an opportunity to eastern regions of original Bengal to develop, and Muslims were in majority in the eastern part of Bengal. In the past, eastern part was neglected because capital was in Calcutta. And you would recall that for a long period of time, Calcutta was also seat of British Indian government. So Calcutta was hub of activity, political center, and eastern parts, which were Muslim majority parts, were neglected. So the Muslims were happy that now they have a province of their own. However, the Hindus and the Congress opposed it. And in 1911, the British acceded to the demand of the Hindus and the Congress. In 1911, King George V was to visit India, and the Indian government didn't want any trouble during his visit. Therefore, the partition of Bengal, which was introduced in 1905 was done away with in 1911. The whole episode, that is first partition of Bengal, then its annulment in December 1911, had a profound impact on Muslim thinking. Now they had a clear evidence in front of them that their interests were clashing with the interests of the majority community. They saw during these years when violence was going on in Bengal that lines between them and the other community were developing very sharply. They realized that they will have to stand on their feet in order to protect and promote their interests, and they could not rely on the majority because the majority has opposed something that was to provide some relief, some advantage, some benefit to the Muslims living in eastern part of Bengal, the region that was neglected in the past, the region where Muslims were suffering because the center of province or the focal point of administration of province was Calcutta, which neglected the eastern part. They felt that sooner or later they will have to stand on their feet to protect their rights and interests. The next important development that we would like to discuss is the SIMLA Deputation of 1906. In fact, SIMLA Deputation is in line with the kind of thinking that was developing amongst the Muslims during that time. That is, they have certain interests and they must stand up to protect their rights, and unless they do that, that objective will not be achieved. The SIMLA Deputation of 1906 was the first systematic attempt on the part of the Muslims to present their demands to the British government and to seek their acceptance. The SIMLA Deputation comprised 35 prominent Muslims from all over India. It was a galaxy of Muslim leaders from all provinces of India, from one end of India to the other, and you had Muslims of all background. Therefore, in 1906, when this deputation called on the Viceroy Lord Minto, it was the most representative Muslim delegation. This delegation, what is known as the SIMLA Deputation, was led by Sir Aga Khan, and Nawab Mohsinul Mulk served as its secretary. And these 35 Muslim personalities met the Viceroy, Lord Minto, in Shimla. That is why it is called the SIMLA Deputation. The memorandum which they presented to the British government was a kind of the demands which were uppermost in the minds of the Muslims at that time. The delegation emphasized that Muslims should not be viewed simply in numerical terms, but they should take into account their historical importance and the kind of contribution the Muslims have made to British India. And keeping in view that importance, they should work towards accommodating their demands. The delegation emphasized that the democratic principle or the principles of election should be introduced, keeping in view the peculiar conditions and circumstances of India, the diversity and the fact that there are different kinds of people living here, the fact that the Muslims consider themselves to be a separate identity. All these things have to be taken into account because India was not a homogeneous, amalgamated or monolithic political identity. It was a political identity comprising diversity, divergence in views, divergence in outlook. And when you introduce some kind of system, then these realities have to be accommodated. In view of these submission, they presented some demands. One, the demand was that the representation to the Muslims should be given more than their population, so that that representation has some significance, some importance, and the representatives are able to play an important role. Second, they demanded the introduction of separate electorate in India. The principle of separate electorate in India implied, as demanded by the Muslims in 1906, that the Muslims should elect Muslim representatives. That is, for electing Muslim representative, only Muslims should vote, and for electing others, those communities should vote, so that Muslims are in a position to elect their representatives that will go to the different institutions of the state in India and represent their point of view. This demand, the demand of separate electorate, was the key demand, the most significant demand the Muslims made at that time. And this demand was accepted by the British in 1909. 3 years later, the principle of separate electorate was introduced in British India, and it remained effective there until 1947. The other demands were for reservation of seats for Muslims in government jobs, in municipal and district boards, in universities, syndicates, and senates. Reservation of seats means that you make sure that Muslims are represented. Certain number of Muslims would definitely be sitting in these institutions. In order to represent their point of view, they also demanded that there should be Muslim representation in the executive council of the Viceroy. The British Viceroy had an executive council, and Indians were represented in small number in that Viceroy's council. And the demand of the Muslims was that Muslims should be accommodated so that they can present their demand. The last significant demand made by the deputation at Shimla was that the college at Aligarh should be elevated to the status of a university. This was a demand the Muslims were advocating for last several years, and this appeared even in this demand list here. Now, if you look at this, the contents of the demands of the Muslims to the Viceroy at Shimla, you will find that this is a very clear manifestation of realization amongst the educated Muslims that there are certain special interests and special concerns of the Muslims which have to be protected. And in order to protect those interests, they will have to get together, organize themselves, and present those demands to the authority for consideration. The third important topic for today's talk is the establishment or formation of the Muslim League. The formation of the Muslim League is the logical step from the Shimla Deputation. This deputation had met the Viceroy on 1st October 1906, and on 30th of December 1906, that is almost 3 months later, the Muslims decided to set up their separate political party called the Muslim League. The Muslim League was established in Dhaka on 30th December 1906. It was set up after the meeting of Muhammadan Educational Conference, which was a meeting in the same city. So Muslims had collected there, had gathered there for that conference, and after that they decided to take one of the most significant steps in Muslim history in India, that is the formation of the Muslim League. This meeting for setting up the Muslim League was chaired by Waqarul Mulk, and the idea of setting up a political organization was proposed by Nawab Salimullah of Dhaka, and this was seconded by Hakim Ajmal Khan and Maulana Zafar Ali Khan. All these Muslim leaders discussed their issues and problems and decided to set up this organization, that is the Muslim League. They argued that time has come when they should have a political organization of their own. Let me recall that during the 19th century, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan had advised that given the situation prevailing at that time, they should focus on education rather than active politics. By the turn of the century, and by 1906, you had a generation of Muslims who had acquired modern knowledge, modern education, English language, and some of them had been educated in England. It is this group of conscious and spirited Muslims who decided to set up an organization. The encouragement for setting up this organization also came from the success of the SIMLA Deputation, where they had gotten together and presented their demands, and now they thought that the next logical step is to have an organization on a permanent base that would pursue the demands which they had presented to the Viceroy. So it was a change of strategy on the part of the Muslims. They thought that now they have a generation of educated people, conditions have changed, where they ought to have a forum of their own, which they created. 1 year later, in the Karachi session, the constitution was approved, and then in March 1908, Sir Agha Khan was formally elected President of the Muslim League. In this way, from December 1906 to 1908, Muslim League came into existence as an autonomous political organization, as a body that began to represent Muslim interests and work for the Muslims of South Asia. What were its goals when it was set up? It had 3 broad objectives. 1, protection and promotion of rights and interests of the Muslims. 2, cooperation with other communities, keeping in view the objective number 1, that is the interests and rights and concerns of the Muslims. 3, promotion of loyalty towards the British government. If you look at these 3 broad objectives, I think 3 basic themes are very clear here. 1, In the light of the SIMLA Deputation, now the Muslims had established a political platform, an organization that was to carry forward what they had presented at Shimla to the Viceroy. Second, they were for working together with other communities. They were willing to cooperate to prepare their programs in consultation with others, to discuss the issues with others. However, they asserted here and also subsequently that their cooperation will be aiming at protection and promotion of their interests. So they were for cooperation, not for conflict. I think third thing which emerges out of these goals is that the Muslims in 1906 were not for agitational politics. The objective was to create a political forum, to create a framework within which they could articulate Muslim demands, aggregate their demands, and then present them in a logical, coherent, and persuasive manner to the British government. So agitational politics was not part of their strategy at that time. They believed that negotiations, dialogue, persuasion is the way that they can achieve their objectives in their interaction with the British government and also with the majority community in India. Fourth subject that we are going to discuss here is the changes in the aims and objectives of the Muslim League in 1913. You would recall that when Muslim League was established in 1906, it had three major objectives. But by 1913, these objectives were somewhat modified. The changes in the Muslim League objectives reflected a change in the outlook and strategies of the Muslim leaders, as well as it brought the two major political parties, the Muslim League and the Congress, closer to each other. During 7 years from 1906, several changes took place in India and outside that wavered the Muslim faith in the British government. And I may very briefly mention those changes. One, the withdrawal of partition of Bengal in 1911 by the British government. Second, there were several developments in the Muslim world which affected the Muslims in British India. The Balkan Wars had started, and Italy was at war with Libya. Italy also fought a war with Turkey. And during these days, when the Balkan Wars were going on, the general Muslim sympathy was for the Muslims. Other important developments that changed Muslim way of thinking was the demolition of a mosque in the city of Kanpur in 1913. Another factor was a realization in the two leading political parties, that is the Muslim League and the Congress, to work closer for achievement of certain political objectives. And they thought that they have to share certain goals. And the most significant factor was the role and contribution of Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who enjoyed respect with both political parties. Though he joined the Muslim League in 1913, but before that, he had contacts and interaction with the Muslim League, and he enjoyed respect with the Muslim League as well as the Congress Party. In 1910 and 11, the Muslim League Council, in its meeting, underlined the need of changing the objectives or revising the objectives in the light of the situation. Quaid-e-Azam attended the council meeting in 1912. He emphasized not only the changes in the objectives, but also the need for working together with the Congress for achieving certain defined goals and objectives. 1 year later, that is in 1913, Quaid-e-Azam formally joined the Muslim League. And from 1913 to 1920, Quaid-e-Azam was member of the Muslim League as well as the Congress Party. It is in 1920 that Quaid-e-Azam left the Congress for good and stayed completely with the Muslim League. In 1913, when the Muslim League met, it decided to change its objectives and bring about or add new things to its goal. One significant change brought in its goals was self-government under the British was declared as one of the important goal of this political party, that the Congress would work for establishing a self-government in India within the British system. Second was that it will have good relations with other communities and would cooperate with other political parties with similar goals and objectives. This change of objectives in Muslim League brought it closer to the Congress Party, because the Congress Party had adopted a similar goal in 1906, that is self-government. And now in 1930, you have the Muslim League adopting the same goal, which brought the Muslim League and Congress together. This resulted in a very significant development in 1916 that we will be discussing very soon. However, going back to the change of objectives of the Muslim League, one has to keep in mind that it reflected the change of method, change of strategy, but the goals remained the same. The goals were protection and promotion of Muslim interests, Muslim rights, and Muslim concerns. In 1906, they were basically working as an organization that would petition the British government for certain concessions and favors. In 1913, the objective was the same. But now, they were making a very clear political demand, self-government in India, and also they were prepared to work with other political parties with similar goals and objectives. This takes me to the fifth important issue that I want to discuss with you, and that is the LACKNOW Pact of 1916. The LACKNOW Pact was a political arrangement between the Muslim League and the Congress Party about future constitutional and political arrangements. Why this agreement became possible? Because in 1913, the Muslim League and the Congress had more or less developed one objective that was common, that is self-government. Second is that by that time, the British were talking about constitutional changes in India in a couple of years' time. Therefore, both parties, in their own way, were thinking what kind of proposals should they prepare. And another reason was that Quaid-e-Azam, who was member of both political parties, was playing a decisive role. He was trying to bring two political parties together for the achievement of certain objectives. It was because of this role of the Quaid-e-Azam that he was described as ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. In 1915, the Muslim League and the Congress held separate sessions in Bombay, and they, on their own, discussed the political agenda which they want to pursue, and also both parties agreed to work together for evolving a constitutional formula, that is, an agreement on certain basic principles. A joint committee of the Congress and the Muslim League prepared a scheme of constitutional and political changes. This scheme was presented to the two political parties in Lucknow in 1916, and both accepted that. That is why this scheme of constitutional changes is described as Lucknow Pact, because it was in that city that they agreed on certain constitutional arrangements. The major features of the Lucknow Pact, or the constitutional formula which the Muslim League and the Congress agreed, were that in the Imperial Legislative Council, which was at that time the highest legislative body within India, Muslim representation should be 1/3. That is, 1/3 seats should be reserved for Muslims. Second, separate electorate. The Congress Party, for the first time, accepted the principles of separate electorate for Muslims. In the past, it had not accepted that, but now through this Lucknow Pact, they had agreed to that. It was also decided that the Muslims would be given representation in Viceroy's Executive Council. They will be Muslim representatives. Similarly, they agreed that at the provincial level, in the Provincial Legislative Council and in Governor's Council, the Muslims would be provided representation, or arrangement will be such that Muslims are represented there. They also agreed that minorities will be given weightage in provinces. Let me explain this concept of weightage. Weightage here meant that the minorities will be given more representation in the provincial legislative bodies than warranted by their numerical strength. In other words, the majority community will surrender some of its representation and minority will get more representation. That is, for an example, if minority has 25% population, they may get representation 26% or 27%, which means the representation of the majority will be reduced. Now, this arrangement was a gesture which the Muslims were making towards Hindus in Muslim majority provinces, and Hindus were making towards Muslims in Hindu majority provinces. Now, this Lucknow Pact is therefore very significant because for the first time Congress accepted separate electorate for Muslims, and it also agreed for Muslim representation at the Imperial Legislative Council or provincial councils, and in this way the Congress accepted the distinct and separate character and separate interests of the Muslims of this region. Let me conclude. In this lecture,